But
okay, so let me offer you a practical problem. I've been talking to Bjorn Lomborg and Matt Ridley on my podcasts, and they're future optimists. In within a materialistic framework, fundamentally, both of them insist that things are not as dire as they're painted. But regardless of that, what they do point to, like um, Steven Pinker, I would say, is that we've made tremendous progress on all sorts of dimensions in the last 300 or 400 years. And there's every reason to assume that we could continue doing that over the next 100 years if we got our priorities straight. It's within our capability. And so you can look at such things. And I think these are hard bits of data, although time frame is always a problem. There are far fewer people in abject poverty by proportion now than there were 40 years ago. And 40 years ago, there were much fewer than there was 100 years ago. And that trajectory appears to be continuing. We can continue to make incremental improvements in the material well-being of everyone and there's limits, obviously, and the economists and the biologists argue about what those limits might be. But one of the problems with that view is that it's not saleable. It doesn't have, for some reason, it doesn't have the kind of motive power that enables people to get on board and get enthusiastic about it.
Well, I also don't think it's, I must say, I have mixed reactions. I'm a fan of Ridley's, not so much Lomborg's. And I have mixed feelings about Pinker's view. There's obviously some truth in it, but I believe it goes out of its way to miss the counter argument. And
well, it might. It might go out of its way to miss even from a rhetorical perspective. And, I would look at that symbolically. I would say, look, there's a tyrant and there's a wise king, and they're both there. And if you only look at the tyrant, that's the corruption of society, then you're missing half the story. And I would imagine that Pinker would say, well, people are looking at the tyrant so hard that we need to look at the wise king a little bit more.
Well, I would take a different approach to this. So I would argue that things have gotten better. The Pinker pattern is recognizable, but that it cannot be indefinitely extended. And that the limit is that we've come to a place where lineage versus lineage competition on a planet of this size with a population as large as we have and the technologies that we've got is a fatal proposition, almost no matter how it plays out. So in order to take the pattern that has continued to this point and extend it indefinitely into the future, you have to do two things. One of them we've already described, which is you have to take the genes out of the driver's seat, which is frankly in the long-term interests of the genes, but genes are too dim to see it, right? So we have to take effectively something like a Buddhist approach to long-term well-being. We have to become very dedicated to the idea of sustainability. And I realize how hard it is to operationalize an idea like that. But somehow we cannot keep degrading the planet and imagining that we're going to technologically rescue it.
Well, I hope your conscience does that, technically speaking. I mean, I'm dead serious about this because you just said something of crucial importance, and I think it's at the core. There's an argument that's always going on now between biologists and economists, I would say, that they're the two camps. And the economists say human ingenuity can continually rescue us from whatever problems are likely to emerge. And the biologists say, well, never forget Malthus. And it's a matter of time frame, which is the argument you made. It's like, well, that's working now. There's that famous bet between Paul Ehrlich and Simon. And Ehrlich wrote The Population Bomb, a very pessimistic book. And he believed at that point, 68, I think, that there would be mass starvation and a terrible shortage of material resources by the year 2000. And he had a famous bet with Simon, who was a genius in his own right, certainly the intellectual match for Ehrlich. And Simon said, no, I'll bet you that everything will be cheaper and people will be less hungry. And Simon won the bet.
Of
Now,
course.
Ehrlich could say, yeah, well, I got it wrong by 50 years, or I got it wrong by 100. Time frames deadly.
Yep.
So, but okay, we can take time frames seriously. I've been taking this idea of an intrinsic, evolutionarily determined, biologically based ethic seriously. And I think that the voice of conscience is the voice of sustainability and iterability speaking within. And it's not overwhelming. It's not overwhelming because you have to sacrifice the future for the present fairly often. It turns out that way, right? Because you have to make snap emergency decisions that might not be in your best long-term interest, but the long-term interest speaks inside you.
Agreed.
And
Agreed.
so,
but less and less well as we have abandoned the mythology that used to undergird it. So as we have become more secular.
Why would you say that? Why would you say that's a very interesting thing to say? Why do you believe that?
Well, first of all, the problem with cultural evolution is that if we talk about genetic adaptations, you can look at virtually any creature, virtually any appendage, virtually any behavior in a non-human creature in its natural environment and be pretty sure it makes a good deal of sense, right? The stuff that didn't make sense got pruned away. It's not there to see. How it makes sense, that's a tough question, but whether it makes sense, not tough, almost ever. In human cultural evolution space, that is not the case, right? We have a huge amount of noise, stuff that will not stand the test of time, that nonetheless dominates our current cultural landscape. And so we can't go into it and assume these things make sense. So what I'm telling you is that, in my view, the religious mythology was doing jobs that we don't know. Some of them we can piece together. Some of them we'll never understand what the role of a particular mythological belief was. But what we have now is kind of an intermediate level of sophistication where we've gotten past some of the religious mythology, but without the wisdom necessary to replace it with anything that does the jobs that it was doing. And so we're now screwing up left and right, you know.
That's the right way to put it too, because most of this, what's happened is that functional mythology has been replaced by inadequate ideology. And the ideology, and I wrote about this in Beyond Order, there's a chapter called Abandon Ideology. I think of ideologies as parasites on a religious platform. They have their power. The power they have is because they derive their power from an underlying mythological narrative structure, but they only tell half the story. If that's akin to that's an idea that's akin to the one that you just laid out.
Yeah, I think so. Although I think you're being generous to call it all ideology. I'd say some of it's just idiocy, right? We've replaced a structure that worked that is now not viable because it's not in the environment for which it adapted, but we've replaced it with something that doesn't stand any chance of working, and we keep one self-inflicted wound after the next. And either we're going to figure out that pattern and recognize that the function that we're using to generate the next level of behavior and culture is a lethal hazard, or it's going to take us out. So I would say the key, if I can go back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, the key to continuing the trajectory of improvement that has been recognized by Pinker and Ridley, at least, is to understand that it needs to be based on something else going forward, that the limits of the system that they are recognizing, we have to go through a revolution in the way we sustain ourselves. We cannot fuel it on lineage versus lineage competition. However, what we mustn't do is either create a stagnation that causes the human beings to react in the way that they do when they run against the limits of a landscape, a physical landscape, or run up against the limits of economic growth, both of which would be a disaster. So we have to create a steady state in which we don't degrade the planet, but we do give the human beings the sensation of living in a time of growth. That's going to be the key, right? Human beings, when they are
Well, I
involved.
want to decorate that slightly. I mean,
Sure.
part of the problem here too is that when you're absolutely deprived, having that deprivation remediated is powerfully motivating. But as the deprivation decreases, the motivating power of the remediation decreases. And so I would also say that arguing for the motivational viability of a more generous material landscape is also a game that is decreasing in its attractiveness. Because,
Right.
you know, one of the things I realized a few years ago was that if you're stuck in traffic, it makes very little difference how expensive your car is. That we've hit the point where many people have enough so that having more isn't going to be of that much utility. And I'm not talking about people who are still absolutely deprived. And I understand full well that a large percentage of the population, decreasing though it may be, are still in a state of absolute deprivation. They're going to be motivated by the desire for material improvement, for sure. But those of us who are past that, and I would say that's virtually everyone in North America that isn't suffering for reasons that material cannot remediate. We're wealthy. We have heat. We have refrigeration. We have an infinite expanse of informational technology. That can all be improved, but the improvements aren't going to make that much difference. What's next? Like, what do you do when you have enough?
All right. So,
and you try to make everyone else have enough. That's something, right? That's something. And it's worth it. But even that that's happening.